Hi everybody. I'm Eddie Tolliver from the Center for Teaching Excellence. We're really excited to have you here. I want to thank all of our Altschulers for participating in this panel. Um, we want to know, these are our most prestigious award winners right here on this room. So congratulations. And we can learn a lot from them. So to introduce them, I'm going to go ahead and read off of their um, basically what the provost has read whenever they won the awards, so you can see why they won these awards. I'm gonna first start with one of our 2022-23 Altshuler Award winner, Dr. Alida Liberman. She's right there in the middle. She's an associate professor of philosophy in the Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences. She stood out as one of the top candidates for several committee members because of her great student evaluations, which included comments like Dr. Liberman engaging topics and her personality when teaching the class were very engaging and thought-provoking, and made this one of the most interesting philosophy classes that I've taken at SMU. And this course confirmed my desire to be a philosophy major. Those are great student evaluation things from a student. The committee also noted that the letters of recommendation from her department chair, which described as without question the most effective teacher in SMU's philosophy department. She's one of the very best teachers I've ever had the opportunity to observe. Finally, she was a national finalist for the APA Prize for Excellence in Philosophy Teaching in 21 and 22. And won it. There you go. She won it in 22 and has presented on topics around teaching. We also have Katherine Carté or Carté? Katherine Carté. She's a professor of history in the Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences. The committee noted that one of her letters of recommendation includes several superlatives and characterized her as innovative historian and teacher. Her department chair letter included student evaluation comments that highlighted her impact on the students, including Professor Carté is amazing. She's passionate about her subject, makes her class so much more valuable. And Dr. Carté was a great teacher whose passion shone through her lessons. Even though the topic was not something I necessarily wanted to pursue after this class, I enjoyed doing the work. And then we have two of 2023 and 2024 Altshuler Award winners, Dr. Daniel Moss, who's an associate professor in the Department of English in the Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences. And his packet stood out to the review committee because they had the most exceptional letter of recommendation from a colleague. And this letter commended his brilliant synthesis of insights in the classroom. And descriptions of his class sessions are nothing short of amazing, with a notable ability to lead students Socratically, fostering an environment where they become deeply engaged with the complexities of language and meaning. Known for his generosity, kindness, and nurturing approach, Professor Moss leaves an indelible mark on students as evidenced by their glowing letters. Notably, a testimonial for an Asian student highlighted his inclusive teaching style, which created a welcoming atmosphere for those who may feel out of place. Dr. Brett Story is an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering, the Lyle School of Engineering. He's also a fellow of the Caruth Institute for Engineering Education, the Hunt Institute for Engineering and Humanity. He exudes a profound passion for teaching and serves as an exceptionally engaged and supporting mentor to the students. And his teaching evaluations were exceptional. And his teaching statement was notably strong. His outreach with Garland Schools showcased a commendable dedication to community engagement. And he also has garnered a stellar recommendation from both peers and students, with recommendation letters deemed among the best committee has encountered. A letter of recommendation from the department associate chair emphasized how he consistently earns top rating from the students in their senior exit surveys and interviews. So you can see, these are awesome professors. We're so happy to have them here. And for this panel, we would like for them to share a little more about your teaching philosophy, things that have worked well for you in the classroom, so we can all learn from you and do the same. So thank you. And I know that Katherine has to leave a little earlier, so you could start. That'd be great. Okay.
Is this on?
Yeah, it should be on.
Okay.
Folks online, can you hear us?
Is it work? Is this on?
It should be on.
Okay, it's not broadcasting in this space, so
Yes.
if it's working online.
Can you
Okay.
hear her? More. Okay. So Mike,
Test,
oh,
test.
here, go now.
Okay, is that okay? It's a pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to talk about teaching, and thank you all for taking time out of your days to do that. We were asked to talk a little bit about our teaching philosophies, and give some specific examples. And I want to start by saying that by couching this and saying that I'm very fortunate to, I think, to teach history. And I'm sure this is true for all of us. There are specific aspects of our disciplines that couch the way that we teach. History is something that students come with a framework for because they live in the world and they hear about the past. But at the same time, we don't have any prerequisites in our department. So any student can be in any class, which means you don't, with the exception of this junior and senior seminars for the majors. And so that means that you can't necessarily assume that they've anticipated any particular factoid, right? So historians are not always great at Trivial Pursuit, although you'd think we would be because, there's a lot of specific factoids out there. And you can't assume that your students have a lot of that information. So that's kind of the both the blessing and the curse of teaching history. For teaching philosophy, I think what I would say is that I really seek to reward and foster intellectual curiosity more than anything else. That's what I most value in conversation partners, not just in students. And I think students respond to urging them to find what they find interesting about the material. This also works very well with the fact that I hate getting bored. And so I am constantly trying to reinvent my classes in a way that keeps me interested. I rarely teach the same material more than twice. I do tend to teach things twice, but after that, I'm likely to switch things up to teach a new class so that it's new to me. And because it's new to me, I'm really interested in it and I'm really open to what the students have to say. And I think that creates a lot of moments where a student says something I didn't anticipate and we stop and talk about that for as long as we're all collectively engaged in it. And that kind of modeling of intellectual curiosity, I think, is something that that works well for them. To give a specific example of that, as something I've actually written about a couple of years ago, it was pre-pandemic, as I guess how we all mark time now, but I think it was 2019. I decided not to have a syllabus for a class, not in terms of not having expectations. I think students need very clear expectations. So they had all of that sort of, legally apparatus for the syllabus and assignment due dates and all that. But I didn't set any of the readings in advance. Instead, I gave them just a few readings at the beginning of the semester that sort of set the tone. And what I gave them were articles about how to read history. This is a course on the American Revolution. And then I let them vote every class what they wanted to read next. In practice, it worked out best if we did that 2 weeks in advance so that I had time to find the reading. And so the really, the students who like to do things in advance would have that in advance. So we did end up, we sort of shifted things a few times over the course of the semester. We also experimented with ways of selecting reading, ways of, did we want to have polls? I did Google polls, but I also had, sort of class groups discuss and come up with suggestions and then have everybody vote on the suggestions. And, tried to come up with a bunch of different mechanisms to get the most possible voices in. And I told them right from the beginning that I didn't care if we spent the entire semester in 1765. We could do nothing but the Stamp Act and we'd call it the American Revolution. Because what I wanted them to do was to see how historians ask questions. And that if they came out of the class with that, it was more important than them coming out with the capacity to, say what the Connecticut Compromise was in crafting the Constitution or something like that. So it worked quite well, except that the students actually produced amazing work. They did better at reading and analyzing than they've ever done in any other class I've taught. They got really frustrated because they wanted a clear narrative and they wanted to have, they wanted to hear the Connecticut Compromise, right? So we kind of, when we talked about this in the class, that what were their expectations of a clear narrative versus historians' understanding of what a clear narrative was. So that's an example of something that worked and also was a little bit more challenging. And the last thing that I'll say is that something that I really firmly believe in after teaching for 20 years is that you can only really teach one or two skills at a time. and that I assume all of our disciplines have lots of different skill sets associated with them. And maybe this is distinctive to history because we don't have prerequisites, but you could try to do many different aspects of history thinking in one course. I've never found that effective. I tend to be very conscious before I go in about what not my content goal is, because I feel like the content is that's what I play with all the time, but what my skill set goal is for them to come out and say, as a historian, this is how we do X, or this is how we ask this kind of question, and that has to be crystal clear for them all the way through, despite the fuzziness of everything else. Thanks.
Sure, we can do it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So that we do talk about not having the right start. So I'm possibly designing a new course right now, and I'm totally thinking about that model, but I'm really scared as well. Because the course on the subject that is only talking a long time, on data. I want to talk about high-level questions, the disciplinary questions we ask political science, but I also want them to be, driving the course. So when you were thinking about planning a course, how do you weigh all these things? What questions occur to you? How do you sort of decide to come out on the side of taking the class?
I think, so the question is, what were the issues going into deciding not to have a syllabus, given both wanting the students to be able to explore, but also wanting to do pretty high level stuff? I think one thing that I had to be fairly confident about is my subject matter. I also love teaching new subjects about which I know less. But I was teaching a class. I was at the same time I was finishing a book that was covering the entire chronology I was teaching, and I felt really comfortable that I would be able to answer any question that they threw at me. And so that was one piece of it. And if it's material you've been teaching for a long time, then that's easy, right? You know where they're going to go. The other thing I think was just being really clear with them about the difference between content and questions, or content and or a specific piece of reading and the generalities. So if you feel that flexibility, it's because of the way your discipline is structured, and you could answer questions in multiple ways, right? And I think making that apparent to the students lets them into the conversation. I will also say that I found an amazing article, which I now have had to resurrect off the Wayback Machine, that invites students into reading footnotes. And it is true. My students have told me, and this article also says, we don't teach our students to read footnotes. They don't know, and in disciplines that use footnotes instead of endnotes and all of that, we don't invite them into the scholarly apparatus as clearly. We sort of think, are they reading that? But we don't really expect it. Actually getting them to read all of the scholarly apparatus, whether it's reading a works cited list and say, okay, what's on this, what's not on this, helped them in that process of the readings being fluid, right? Because then, at the very least, they find connections, right? They see something you've already read is cited someplace else. And then they understand that you made that connection because the writers themselves were making that connection. But it was a little bit stressful, and I did have to deal with student pushback of people who said, I wanted to learn about Valley Forge. We did not read Valley Forge. Okay, you've got Wikipedia for that. Go look it up. I not exactly the same way. COVID intervened and all that. This semester I'm teaching the same course, but I'm only giving them 3 weeks where they pick all their own readings. And that'll be at the end of the semester.
Can I ask a question about the things around readings? Do you have them a list of readings to choose from, or are they coming up with topics and then you're finding the readings this way?
That's a great topic. Yes, they came up with the topics. They said, like, I mean, to get the most silly thing, they said on Halloween, they wanted to read something about ghost stories. So I found something about folklore and ghost stories from Dutch New York. And then I found a Nathaniel Hawthorne story about ghosts in the Stamp Act. And so yes, they would say, this is the subject we want. And then I would find a high quality reading that I felt like, and that also gave me the capacity to make sure we covered our bases. You know, like if they had entirely skipped women, I would have found a way to get that in there, that kind of stuff. They didn't find the readings. I found the readings for them. They chose the topic and I found the reading. So, and that was the other thing is they all had to do the same reading. So they asked the question, they chose the topic, and it ended up being 4 classes before the time they had to read it. And I had to get it up right after that class. And then they would have 3 classes. And it also meant, by the way, we couldn't order any books. There's nothing could be ordered in advance. And so I was limited to articles and chapters. So those were the constraints.
Question I'd like to ask. It sounds both intensive on your part. So how did you handle that? Because you're instead of planning out a course from the beginning to end, it's a live thing, right?
Yeah.
Like that. But how did you handle the extra time?
So it didn't feel like a lot of extra work. I think because why didn't it feel? Because I'm always changing up the readings all the time anyway. And so that part of the amount of time I spent doing class preparation didn't particularly change. I think that the main difference is that there are things other professors do that are probably really helpful, like having reading questions and things like that I tend not to do. If I was a person who had a very developed apparatus for a particular set of readings that I believed in and accomplished a certain goal through, I would be far less comfortable tossing it out all the window. But because I'm tossing everything out all the time, it's just my style.
I'll go. So I'm in the area of engineering, and specifically civil engineering. So where you don't have any prereqs, we got prereqs 8 ways on every course, it seems like. And one of the challenges that I have found is that level of confinement. And I think we do in general, not only at universities, but down, in high schools. We are really good at training students how to be really good at doing well in courses. And I find this to be the case in engineering and the courses I teach in civil engineering. For example, they will knock it out of the park in the first course in a sequence of mechanics, and then also on the second and also on the third. And then when they go to take their professional licensing exam, they have a very difficult time connecting all of those things, finding common threads through all those courses. And I kind of look at that and I say, well, your average was a 98 in each of these courses. How do you not know how to do this at the end of the day? Well, I didn't know that we had to connect this idea from this idea to this idea. So I think that's a real challenge. And so what I've tried to do, well, that's the first challenge. The second challenge, I think, is students now are inundated with information, right? Information is not worth what it used to be, because it's not necessarily worth their time to remember something because they can just look it up here in 2 seconds. And so getting students to connect the dots and become enthusiastically engaged in the classroom, I think, are the 2 main challenges that I've been working on addressing. So as far as teaching philosophy, my goal has been to engage the students and get them enthusiastic about material early and often. And the way that I typically try to do that is kind of similar to what you're saying about having flexibility on things. So I will pull examples in that could be abstract or concrete kind of examples from my research, for example, and bring that in and set that in front of them and ask them questions, and they engage about that. For example, I'm a bridge engineer. So I've got like a really great example of this that touches a lot of areas that just happened yesterday with the tragedy in Baltimore. And so there's a lot of issues that are structural in lots of different parts of those different sequenced classes that all tie together, that you have to have a really good handle on with a handoff from one class to another class to understand. And so I'll kind of start with that and then kind of fill in the gaps with the content, the technical content as we go. That seems to be a pretty good way of doing it, of getting students engaged. They bring their interests to the table, and then they can make the connection between what was formerly a pretty abstract idea of a differential equation to, well, that's just boing, 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 like making the sound of vibration on the bridge as it's collapsing or whatever. Making those type of, you know, now I'm the only idiot making the noise up here, but I make them make the noise and then say, well, that's all you need to know about differential equations, something like that. And it usually gets like a little bit of a snicker laugh, but then at least I've got them thinking about, okay, yeah, that's right. Now all those sines and cosines kind of make sense. And so it just kind of gets them to where they're not just trying to get the grade at the end, but actually understand the information. I think that's a real challenge to do in engineering, and I'm always open to new suggestions for that. So I'm taking notes mentally as I listen here. One thing I wanted a concrete example in kind of the way that I've done things and some of the things that I've learned that have been super useful. So the provost mentioned, I hate to call it outreach because it's not really outreach with the Garland program. We have a research project where the students, we basically do co-teach a class over at Garland High, 2 to 3 times a week, depending on what A day or B day schedule they're on. And so I have students over there. Sometimes I go over there, but then the students also, the high school students work in my lab over the summer, and we do real research projects. Okay, so it's very much, yeah, if I've got a project on the Army working on this thing, we work on that in the class. So it's very flexible. It gets them engaged. And so I learned early on in that program when I was over there, I'll just give you an example. So one day we were learning about bridges and truss bridges specifically. And so I gave just a killer lecture on Newton's laws with sines and cosines. And I was just showing them all this. And I noticed this side of the classroom totally engaged, trying to understand, writing it all down, just smoke coming up from the pencils writing. And the other half of the class just totally, heads down, just kind of asleep on their phones, whatever. And so the unique part about this course that can explain that divide on that particular day is that it has no prerequisite. So there are students that are like your high-end academically IB kind of students that are going to go wherever they want and do whatever they want and be tremendously successful. Garland has a very strong population of those students. They also have students that are kind of at risk for graduation, not kind of at risk for graduation, at risk for graduation. And both those students are kind of in this class together, which is not that common at the school. And so naturally, they kind of just, got kind of congregated in their groups that they had seen in other classes. And that's what was going on there. I kind of had these IB students, eating out of the palm of my hand, learning all about these wonderful things. And then these other students that maybe hadn't had, trigonometry or something like that yet checked out long ago because they felt like they had nothing to contribute or learn from this, or it wasn't accessible. And so I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. We can do better on this. So the first half of the class was that. The second half of the particular lecture that day was we were going to go build a bridge out in the back of the classroom. So we had big steel members and bolts and everything, with hammers, safety glasses, all that sort of thing. And so I said, all right, let's go build this thing now that we've analyzed it. And so the students that were really enthusiastic ran back there, started trying to put this thing together. And the other students kind of went slowly back there, and an amazing thing happened. The students that were really keen on the kind of the board stuff, kind of the engineering kind of stuff, started putting it together and got really frustrated and like angry, frustrated, not just like discouraged, like angry. These pieces should go together. I've done Legos, and Legos go together. You click them together, right? And this piece should go here. I know it's marked right. The board, Newton told me this piece should go here, right? And so what ended up happening was that some of these students over here that felt totally disengaged before were looking at that, and I was, conversing with them, and it's, I've worked on, I do welding with my father. He's in construction or something like that, and I know how to do that. And so they go over and they'd say, well, yeah, they don't fit together. You got to bang on them with a hammer, right? And you gotta line this up, and this tolerance isn't right, and all this. And then it was like this huge watershed moment, light bulb thing for me, because I saw at the end of that class period, one class period, the students began to see that not everybody has all the same skill sets, right? And I can learn from anybody in this room. I may have the highest math grade in high school, but I can learn from this person who I've never, gotten my hands dirty. I couldn't engineer my way out of a wet paper bag, but I can learn from them on how to do these things. And then I can show them, kind of relate that to the board. And so that was 2 or 3 years before COVID, actually. And so we took that kind of watershed moment and we've tried to replicate it ever since. And it's been just an amazing thing. And I try to do that in my classes now too, with getting groups in civil engineering. It's rather easy because we have lots of different disciplines within civil engineering. And so we can get water resources people talking to transportation, talking to structures. And while it may not be a physical hands-on versus kind of an egghead engineering differentiation in the skill sets, it's different skill sets, diverse skill sets coming together to solve a problem. Really works, really gets the students engaged, and they have kind of ownership of that thing. And they start forming these new cohorts that aren't based on GPAs or what classes they're going for or classes they're in. They have these kind of, yeah, we solved this problem together. Look, we built this awesome truss. And here's what happens if you put too much load on it right here. And now all that group is kind of working together and getting that experience. So that's just kind of a one example I wanted to share. And just trying, but to do that, you have to be very flexible on what's going to happen that day. And I will echo, I think, what you said, to be flexible in the classroom, especially when you get to the university level. All students are smart, whether we believe it or not. It is true that they are smart, right? And so you really have to know your material, right? And so I've struggled with the time balance issue on what do we do and I haven't found a solution for that. And it's got to just work really hard. And luckily for me personally, I have a strong passion for doing this. So that part is enjoyable to me. And I also try to get it to line up with research so I can satisfy those requirements of the job. Anyway, that's just kind of a quick example. I'd be happy to discuss any more, but that's all my prepared remarks. So.
That's the microphone. Yeah. Folks online.
So both of you mentioned that pre-pandemic, things were glorious. And post-pandemic, neither one of you said that you were actually doing what you did pre-pandemic. Could you all address the changes in the most recent years?
So we, from my program, as far as the Garland program and what I've actually translated lots of that information into my courses. I am still doing exactly the same thing we did through COVID. So we were kind of virtual before virtual was cool. We had set up a lab, or we had virtually connected the lab over at Garland that we built and the lab here. So we were kind of doing these things, and we were set up to do these things pretty seamlessly afterwards. Even the summer program where everybody was remote, we still had high school students working with us and this sort of thing. That's not to say that my courses are immune from the challenge that we had post-COVID. I found the students to be very different post-COVID, and it's just such a small data set size for me right now. I don't know how to make any conclusions from it, but I've had the class that I taught last semester was just phenomenally engaged. The one before that, it was just pulling teeth to have any interaction at all. So I don't know if that's going to just kind of get better and wash out. But so I don't have a great answer for any of that. I think my solution has been just keep trying to do what we were doing, and that has been kind of working out, although takes a little bit of extra work. I will say bribery works. So we have cookies and coffees out here. I do cookies and say, come to my after out of class review sessions and I'll bring you cookies or pizza or whatever it is. And that has helped to kind of reestablish this kind of community cohort within the students. So that's maybe one technique you can.
I would say I'm also doing similar things, not exactly what I did that in that class, but I will, the students are different. That's the biggest change. Though we're now up to our freshmen having been freshmen in COVID, right? So we're kind of working through those classes, and it does feel like this semester attendance is better than it was previous semesters. I don't have the data to back that up, but I feel like they're coming back. But they are coming back with more mental health problems and more crises, and maybe just more comfort articulating that. So that feels like something that we're probably all thinking about.
Go ahead, we have yeah, we need to leave the room by 1:50 for the class. So you guys can go, maybe we'll do questions after both of you.
Sure.
And if we can't do it in this class, we can move to this lobby area.
Great. So I want to talk about some overarching principles or values that are central to my teaching practice that I found helpful for thinking about effective teaching. The first is alignment. So we come up with learning goals for our students. How do we want them to be different at the end of the course from the way they are now? We develop pedagogical activities and assignments for them to do inside and outside of the classroom. We create formal and informal assessments to help us judge what they've learned. And this is going to sound really obvious, but it can be surprisingly hard to miss in practice, which is that these three things have to be in alignment with each other. And that requires asking yourself tough, critical questions. How do your pedagogical activities actually support your learning goals? Are your assessments actually accurately measuring progress towards those goals? So suppose my learning goal is students will become independent critical thinkers, but I'm mostly lecturing and then having them explicate what I've said in the lectures on their tests and papers. They're not working towards that goal of independence, even if they are getting the critical component. And so people will often ask me broad questions like, do you think we should be assigning primary sources in introductory classes or something like that? And my answer to these kinds of questions is always the same. It depends, and it depends on what your learning goals are. Some goals are going to be served by having students grapple with primary text, some are not. And in the same discipline, even in the same class, the answer may be different depending on what those foundational goals are. So alignment between goals, activities, and objectives. And assessment. The second thing I like to focus on is transparency or openness about what I'm doing in the classroom and why. I think that this can increase student motivation, and it's also a form of accountability for me as an instructor. So I don't engage in a classroom activity if I'm not ready to explain to students why it's valuable for achieving the course goals. For that reason, I put on my syllabus a 3-columned chart where I list the learning goals, and then I list, here are the activities we're going to do to complete them, and here's the assessment, how we'll know whether we've completed these. And I always tell them that they can challenge me if they feel like they're doing busy work. They don't. But I'm waiting for the day that one of them will. And if I don't have an answer for them, I say, yeah, okay, we'll stop doing that if I can't explain to you why we're doing it. I also like to explain to students why the assignments are structured in the way that they are. So for example, when I first started teaching, I had students do reading quizzes, and I've since then shifted to graded for completion, structured but open-ended reading reflections. And I tell them that the reason for this is that I want to incentivize reading even if you don't understand it, and productive engagement even if you don't understand the content well enough to accurately answer quiz questions. So that's why you have this kind of assignment instead of that kind of assignment. Another part of transparency, I think, is making the implicit presumptions of your discipline or of the academy as explicit as possible. This is also really important for equity reasons. Something like office hours, some students know what that means, some don't. I've started following a colleague calling it student drop-in hours. Just being really explicit about what our terminology is, and not taking, and this was already mentioned, not taking any background knowledge for granted. And one of the ways I do this is trying to emphasize the importance of background knowledge for comprehension. So I have an exercise I do in the first week of class where I've had them read something about how to read philosophy, and we're talking about strategies for reading. And then I give them an excerpt from the sports pages describing a Cowboys football game. And I ask them, like, who understands this? And, 90% of them get all of it. Most of them understand most of it. I pretend to know nothing about football, like absolutely nothing. It's not much of a stretch. I'm not really pretending very much. And I ask them all of these follow-up questions like, well, wait a minute, who are the Cowboys? Wait, they're Dallas's team? It didn't say they were Dallas's team. Was a high score good? Is a high score bad? And then I give them a bit describing a cricket match from a sports page. And I ask who understands this. And very few of them do, because most of them are culturally familiar with football and not with cricket. And I try to get them to see, look, these are equally difficult, right? They're written for the same kind of newspaper at the same degree of reading comprehension difficulty, but it's your missing background knowledge. And I think that this can help with some of the anxiety students have where their identity is wrapped up in being a good student and in not being, quote, stupid. And if they don't understand something, it can be very easy to have that fixed mindset and to stop. And so I try to encourage them to see how missing background knowledge can be what's going amiss there, and be very explicit about that. The third value I like to focus on is charity, not in the sense of giving your time and money, but in the philosopher's sense of the intellectual virtue of interpreting the views of others in the best light possible. If it's ambiguous, whether they could have meant A or B, and A is a good argument and B is a bad argument, interpret them as having meant A. And I think that charitable interpretation is a pedagogical virtue that I try really hard to give students the benefit of the doubt unless proven otherwise, even though sometimes this is a bit emotionally difficult. Because it's very easy to assume that a student who does poorly or is on their phone all class or turns in an assignment that was obviously written with ChatGPT is being, sort of unengaged and not trying at best and downright rude and disrespectful at worst. But maybe I failed to clearly explain the content or my expectations for the assignment. Maybe they're dealing with a personal tragedy that they shouldn't have to disclose to me in order to get accommodation for it. Maybe they're overwhelmed by their commitments in the same ways all of us are. Maybe they don't understand what appropriate uses of AI are and aren't. And so I try to think about what would our course policies be like if we presumed the best of our students as a default. Even if that's not always true, right? Presume that they're all really well-intentioned and they want to be there. Would you require documentation for excused absences? Would you let them use laptops? How would you respond to academic integrity violations? What would your late work policy be? Would you count attendance and participation in their grades? And how do we think about those questions from the presumption of charity? And I want to be clear that I think there's room for a lot of reasonable and productive disagreement about all of these questions. I tend to be on the less strict side. I think it's perfectly respectable and pedagogically valuable to be on the more strict side, depending on your context. But that it's something worth thinking explicitly about. So then my fourth value, there's only 5 of them, so we're almost done. My fourth is inclusion. And the way I like to think about inclusive pedagogy is recognizing how there are lots of factors outside of a student's control that can influence their academic performance in ways that do not correspond at all to their level of skill, to their effort, or to how much they have learned. And that's going to include things like external constraints on their time or finances, whether their body and mind is functioning in typical or expected ways as those of their peers, the extent to which their background has prepared them to succeed in a college environment. And that could be anything from knowing that it's okay to ask for extra help, to being assertive and challenging a professor, to speaking up if you think you don't understand something. And that's really, really strongly correlated to socioeconomic class, to the many intersectional ways that their identity is impacting how they're understanding themselves and being perceived by others in the classroom. And so what I see as an inclusive approach to pedagogy is doing your best to try to minimize the impact that these contingent external factors will have on students' successes. And it's not going to be possible to reduce completely or eliminate those impacts. But what can we do to not exacerbate it? And a lot of what we ask our students to do is a lot easier for students who are full-time, young adult, residential, affluent students from educational backgrounds that have prepared them well for college. And that is a lot of our SMU students, but it's importantly not all of them. And when we're thinking about something like extra credit, my department is co-hosting the McGuire lecture next week, and we've been strongly encouraged to offer extra credit or whatever we can to incentivize students to attend. I don't offer extra credit for attending events outside of class hours because it's just not equally accessible. Instead, I'm giving participation credit for either this or finding a lecture on YouTube that you approve with me and watch, right? Finding ways to make it equally accessible. Something like dressing professionally for a class presentation is going to be a lot easier for someone who already owns professional clothes, whose body size hasn't been shifting, whose gender expression hasn't been shifting, right? So I think it can be easy for us to ignore these kinds of concerns at a college that has disproportionately highly privileged students, like SMU does. But it's important to recognize that there's stuff going on in the lives even of our surface level privileged students that we don't know about, and that that's not the experience of every student at SMU. And so I think it's worth prioritizing inclusion in these various ways. Finally, the last thing I'm working on incorporating into my classes is joy. And this is a work in progress, but especially in general education courses, my dream is a classroom culture that is prioritizing things other than narrow disciplinary excellence traditionally construed. So that is prioritizing things like curiosity, having fun and pursuing what brings you joy, even if it's maybe not done as at high a level as it could be. Taking risks and experimenting with new ideas, testing your limits, getting outside your comfort zone as a student, but as an instructor, letting students pick. That's scary, right? Especially if it's content that you aren't super expert in. Maybe you can figure out how to learn it together. Cultivating community, building each other up as you're praising each other's successes and productive failures, understood as good things worth praising. And in a perfect world, this would involve students who are independently motivated to study philosophy for the love of it, who don't have the external pressures and anxieties that come from worrying about numerical grades factored into GPAs that impact future work prospects and that turn that classroom sometimes into an agonized space. Realistically, we're not going to get to that perfect world anytime soon. But in the meantime, I've been work in progress trying to figure out how to seek ways to find more moments of joy, collaboration, and community in the classroom.
Is this working? Yeah. I have like all this 3 pages of stuff that isn't going to happen, and instead, maybe I'll seize upon some of the things y'all have said, namely, for instance, the maybe risk taking or the element of chance. I've never gone without a syllabus at all. But I do try to incorporate choice everywhere, whether it's in the paper topics. So they get 4 different paper topics, and they choose one for the first paper, and they choose one for the second, and they can come and talk to me during drop-in hours, right? And we'll figure out which one. Sometimes they'll be like, I can't decide between these 3, and so we'll talk it out and which way is going to work. But also in terms of the reading, more and more, especially when I teach a class on lyric poetry, where we're talking about 14-line poems or whatever, I'll assign kind of an insurmountable number and then say read any 20. And then come and be ready to talk. And if I need them to read a couple of particular ones, because I know we're going to focus on those, I'll say you do want to read these 3. But I also, let's incorporate an element of randomness into the discussion, because this student is going to be able to bring up my mistress eyes are nothing like the sun. That student is going to be able to bring up because I could not stop for death, and we can talk about how 2 very different poets incorporate rhyme or something like that. So I think I like that element of chance in it. That said, if you're going to yesterday, for instance, I was stuck in traffic light at Northwest Highway, and I almost didn't get to my own class. I did not have time to prep my class as I usually like, and that included, basically the yesterday involved poetry of patriotism and protest. That's where we are in my intro to poetry class, and there are kind of 3 ways in which that class can work. And it depends on which texts we're going to focus on, and so I didn't have time to really write out for myself in bullet points which one it was going to be tomorrow. So I just asked the students, do you want World War I, Ireland, or sort of Civil War meets Vietnam? Okay, those are going to be our sort of options, and they voted narrowly for World War I. So I guess that it wasn't a cheery class, but it was an effective one. But it's sort of it's incumbent upon me, if I'm going to do something like that, to have all 3 options ready to go. I mean, I need to do all the reading myself, and that does involve sacrifice, right? I don't watch much TV. I read a lot. I don't listen to many podcasts. If I'm teaching Shakespeare, I'll get some unabridged audiobook and listen to it on my commute, because I need to be ready. But that has its rewards, because at the end of the day, happily, I teach poetry and drama, so it's always like it's going to be as good as any podcast, and in fact a lot better. And I'd kind of rather be reading Emily Dickinson than watching season 16 of Game of Thrones, which is really clumsy stuff. Like I just that's I guess my taste. And it also is a great advantage in the classroom. Like I feel like I always feel like I'm the luckiest professor at SMU because all I really have to do is be Shakespeare's wingman, or I don't know, like what's the lineman for the quarterback? Like I have to be nose tackle for Emily Dickinson, and she's going to throw a great Hail Mary. And so I don't know if the sports metaphor is working as well as I wanted to, but I'll just say that like if you screw up like some of this stuff that's really on you, it's hard to do in some cases. I mean, there's a way in which you have to demystify things. There's a way in which it's Shakespeare, so it must be big and important, or it's poetry, so it must be deep and heartfelt. And you have to turn it into, maybe more of a game, right? And sort of show the students how to play the game, how poets are going to rewrite the rules on you. So, for instance, any child can play rhyme time, right? But when you play that game with Emily Dickinson, it's not just going to be blue rhymes with true, but you're going to get a whole spectrum of half rhymes and off rhymes and identical, homophones and so on. And she's going to start expanding the field of play. And so, in Rhyme Week and poetry, we'll look to her to help us understand, how that same old game can be augmented and expanded, and that'll make the game more fun, I think. So that would just be kind of one example of making it into a game. You can do it with Shakespeare too, of course, pretty much every step of the way. And you want to demystify things. You want to show how they do it, rather than what it means. I think how does it work is such a better question than what does it mean. For that reason, I love poems, which obviously mean one thing, or obviously mean two things, and you're never going to decide which one is right. That's just ambiguity. And then once we get past that question, we can pay closer attention to how they do it. And when you do that, you start to identify cool things, and I think the students can follow the rules of the game, learn to like to play that game, and it can be a serious game, right? Sylvia Plath plays a lot of games. I don't think they're ever funny ones, maybe a couple times, but it's still, I think, sort of making language do new tricks and using it as a new means of expression. And students, I think most of them will end up wanting to be able to stop saying, oh, he's a genius or she's tormented, instead learn to play the games on their terms, and they'll have fun doing it, I think.
Thank you.
We have right on time, but we'll welcome you to come to the lobby, and maybe if you have a few minutes to answer some questions. I also want to plug something else. One of the initiatives that we did for the CT this year, some of the award winners have offered sessions of their classrooms that people can go in and observe them teach. One of the sessions coming up, Dr. Liberman has made one of her classes available, so you can go to. No one has signed up yet, so it's only one person at a time. So if you just want to come and sit on her class and see how she does things, you can sign up. And there's on our booking, just go to the CT website and there's events over there. So through our booking system, and you can go and register over there. But you can see that, other award winners have done as well. So Dr. Jennifer O'Brien is another one that is available. Dr. Constantine Icliano had made 2 of his classes available. So take advantage of this, because all of our award winners have opened their classrooms for other faculty to observe them. So it's a great opportunity. Thank you. Thank you.